The crystal chandeliers of the Vanderbilt estate ballroom seemed to dim as Lorenzo stepped up to the microphone. His tailored suit impeccable, but his hands trembling slightly. "Father, Mother, everyone here tonight. I have something to say that will change everything. I am gay, and I am choosing to build my life with the man I love, Matteo." The room, packed with 200 of the most powerful names in New York finance and old money society, fell into a silence so complete that the faint clink of a dropped champagne flute echoed like a gunshot. Richard Vanderbilt, Lorenzo's father and the iron-fisted CEO of Vanderbilt Global, sat frozen at the head table, his jaw locked, while his wife Eleanor pressed a linen napkin to her lips as if to stifle a scream. Lorenzo's younger sister Emily stared with wide eyes, and his brother James slowly set down his wineglass, the color draining from his face. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until it felt like the entire mansion was holding its breath. Lorenzo's heart hammered against his ribs, but for the first time in 28 years, he felt the weight of secrecy lift from his shoulders. He scanned the crowd until he found Matteo standing near the marble columns at the back, dark eyes steady and proud, the only anchor in the storm. This was the moment Lorenzo had rehearsed in lonely hotel rooms and late-night drives across the city, the declaration that would either free him or burn every bridge he had ever known. He had grown up in these gilded halls, trained since childhood to become the perfect heir, the future face of a multi-billion-dollar empire built on real estate, tech acquisitions, and ironclad family image. Coming out had never been part of the plan. Yet here he was, 30 seconds after the words left his mouth, watching his entire world recalibrate in real time. A low murmur finally rippled through the guests like wind through dry leaves, but no one dared interrupt the patriarch. Richard's chair scraped back with deliberate slowness. He rose, all 6'3" of controlled fury, and the silence returned heavier than before. Lorenzo met his father's gaze without flinching, though inside he felt the familiar twist of guilt and defiance that had haunted him since college. He remembered the first time he had admitted the truth to himself at 19. Alone in a dorm room after a disastrous blind date, his mother had arranged with the daughter of a board member. The relief had been immediate, followed by terror. Now that terror was public, and the consequences were already unfolding in the micro-expressions of every person in the room. Matteo took one quiet step forward, offering silent support without speaking, and Lorenzo drew strength from that single movement. The speech he had prepared for months dissolved into something simpler. "I'm not asking for permission," he said, voice clear and steady. "I'm informing you of my choice. Matteo is the man I love, and I will not hide him anymore." Another beat of silence. Then the first crack appeared. Eleanor let out a soft sob that cut through the air like glass. James muttered something under his breath that sounded like betrayal. Emily's phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the table. Lorenzo felt the shift in the atmosphere, the invisible line he had just crossed, the point of no return. He had expected shouting, threats, maybe even immediate disownment, but this stunned quiet was somehow worse. It forced every person in the room to confront the truth without the buffer of anger. He stepped down from the podium, legs surprisingly steady, and walked straight to Matteo. Their hands met in the open for the first time in front of anyone who mattered, fingers intertwining with quiet certainty. The simple gesture seemed to break the spell. Whispers erupted everywhere. Phones appeared. Lorenzo knew tomorrow's headlines would be brutal, but tonight he only cared about the warmth of Matteo's palm against his. Richard finally spoke, voice low and lethal. "We will discuss this in private." It was not a request. Lorenzo nodded once, the weight of years of performance settling back onto his shoulders even as freedom sang in his veins. He had done it. The announcement was out, the family was silent, and the rest of his life was about to begin. As they left the ballroom together, Matteo squeezed his hand and whispered, "You were brave." Lorenzo smiled for the first time all evening, but deep down he knew the real battle was only starting. The drive home to Matteo's modest apartment in Brooklyn felt like crossing continents. They didn't speak much, just held hands across the console while the city lights blurred past. Lorenzo replayed every facial expression from the ballroom, cataloging the disappointment, the confusion, the calculation in his father's eyes. He had spent years building walls, dating women for appearances, smiling through charity galas while his heart ached for something real. Meeting Matteo 4 years ago at a quiet art gallery opening had cracked those walls wide open. Matteo, with his paint-stained jeans and easy laugh, had never asked Lorenzo to be anyone but himself. Tonight that honesty had exploded into the open, and Lorenzo wondered how many pieces of his old life would survive the blast. When they reached the apartment, Matteo poured 2 glasses of cheap red wine and they sat on the fire escape under the stars. "You don't have to do this alone," Matteo said softly. Lorenzo leaned against him, breathing in the familiar scent of turpentine and safety. "I know, but they will come for us. My father doesn't lose." Matteo kissed his temple. "Then we don't lose either." The words felt like armor. Lorenzo closed his eyes and let himself believe them for one quiet moment. The next morning the phones started ringing before dawn. Board members, lawyers, distant cousins, even the family priest. Lorenzo silenced every call and focused on the man sleeping beside him. For the first time he understood that choosing love meant choosing consequences, and he was ready to face them all. The silence from last night had been the calm before a very public storm, and Lorenzo Vanderbilt was stepping into it with his head high and his hand in Matteo's. By the time the sun rose over Brooklyn, the news had already leaked. Lorenzo's phone buzzed with alerts from every major outlet. Vanderbilt Heir comes out in shocking family speech. He scrolled past the headlines, stomach tight, and set the device on silent. Matteo was still asleep, dark hair tousled against the pillow, and Lorenzo allowed himself a moment to simply watch him. This was the life he had chosen. Quiet mornings instead of boardroom battles. Love instead of legacy. The guilt arrived right on schedule, whispering that he was throwing away generations of work. He pushed it down and made coffee. When Matteo woke, they ate breakfast on the tiny balcony, talking through the practicalities. Matteo's teaching job at a local community college paid enough for their simple life, but Lorenzo's trust fund and executive salary had always been the invisible safety net. "I can get a job," Lorenzo said. Matteo laughed softly. "You? In a 9 to 5? If it means we stay together, yes." The conversation moved to family. Eleanor had left 3 voicemails, each more pleading than the last. Richard had sent a single text, "My office. 10 a.m. No excuses." Lorenzo stared at the message until the screen dimmed. He had spent years perfecting the art of being the son his father wanted, straight-A student, varsity athlete, charming at galas. The mask had grown so comfortable he sometimes forgot it was there. Meeting Matteo had changed everything. They had connected over a shared love of old jazz records at that gallery opening, talking for hours while the rest of the crowd mingled. Lorenzo had never felt so seen. Their first date had been a picnic in Central Park. Nothing flashy, just sandwiches and honest conversation. By the 3rd month, Lorenzo knew he was in love. Hiding it had been torture. Late-night texts, stolen weekends in upstate cabins, always careful never to be photographed together. The secrecy had started to poison him from the inside. Last night's announcement was the antidote. Now the poison was spilling outward. At 9:30, Lorenzo kissed Matteo goodbye and drove to the Vanderbilt Tower in Midtown. The elevator ride to the 72nd floor felt endless. When the doors opened, his father's assistant looked at him with something between pity and disapproval. Richard was waiting behind his massive oak desk, city skyline glittering behind him. "Sit." Lorenzo sat. The next 40 minutes were a masterclass in controlled rage. Richard listed every consequence. Frozen accounts, removed from the board, public statements distancing the family from this phase. Lorenzo listened without interrupting, absorbing each blow like a boxer who had trained for this exact fight. When his father finally paused for breath, Lorenzo spoke. "I'm not asking you to understand. I'm telling you I'm done pretending." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You think love is enough to survive in this world? Without the family name you're nothing. Then I'll be nothing on my own terms." The words hung between them. Richard stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the city he had conquered. "Your mother is devastated. Your sister cried all night. James is already fielding calls from investors." Lorenzo felt each name like a stone in his chest. He had always been the golden child, the one who never caused problems. Now he was the problem. Yet beneath the guilt a quiet strength was growing. He thought of Matteo waiting at home, of the future they could build without the constant fear of discovery. "I love you, Dad. But I love him more." Richard turned, face unreadable. "Then you're no longer welcome in this house." The words should have shattered Lorenzo, but instead they felt like release. He stood, nodded once, and walked out without looking back. In the elevator, he allowed himself one deep breath. The descent mirrored the collapse of his old identity, and when he reached the lobby he felt lighter than he had in years. Back in Brooklyn, Matteo listened without judgment while Lorenzo recounted every detail. They spent the afternoon packing Lorenzo's few personal items from the family penthouse that security had already boxed and delivered. Among the suits and watches was a small leather journal Matteo had given him on their first anniversary. Inside, Lorenzo had written private thoughts he had never shared with anyone. Reading them now, he realized how long he had been preparing for this day. That evening they cooked pasta together, opened a bottle of wine, and talked about what came next. Matteo suggested Lorenzo volunteer at the community center where he taught art therapy. "You have money for now, but you need purpose." Lorenzo agreed. The idea of helping others navigate their own identities felt right. As night fell, they lay on the couch watching an old movie, Lorenzo's head on Matteo's chest. For the first time the future felt like theirs alone. But the calm was temporary. The next morning Emily called, voice shaking. "Dad's calling an emergency board meeting. They're voting to remove you completely." Lorenzo closed his eyes. The war had moved from the dining room to the corporate battlefield. He thanked his sister and hung up, already calculating his next move. Matteo squeezed his shoulder. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Lorenzo believed him. The silence that had started in the ballroom was spreading, reshaping every relationship he had ever known, and he was ready to walk through the wreckage towards something real. The days that followed blurred into strategy sessions with a sympathetic lawyer friend and late-night conversations with Matteo about values versus wealth. Lorenzo discovered that losing the family money hurt less than he expected. What hurt more was the slow realization that some relationships had only ever been conditional. His college roommate, once a close confidant, sent a text full of awkward distance. A cousin who had always joked about finding the right girl now avoided his calls. Each small rejection chipped away at the armor Lorenzo had worn for so long. Yet each chip revealed the man underneath, stronger, clearer, more himself. Matteo watched the transformation with quiet pride. One evening he brought home a canvas and paints. "Paint what freedom looks like," he said. Lorenzo stared at the blank surface for a long time before his brush moved. The result was messy but honest, streaks of blue and gold that somehow captured the feeling of standing in that ballroom and speaking his truth. He hung the painting above their bed as a reminder. The board meeting loomed like a storm cloud. Lorenzo prepared meticulously, reviewing financial statements and drafting a statement of his own. He no longer wanted control of the empire, but he refused to be erased from it without a fight. On the morning of the meeting he chose a simple navy suit, no tie, and kissed Matteo goodbye with steady hands. "I love you," he said. Matteo smiled. "Go remind them who you are." The conference room was packed. Richard sat at the head, flanked by lawyers. Lorenzo took his seat at the far end, the symbolic distance not lost on anyone. The vote was swift. Majority in favor of removal. Lorenzo signed the papers without argument, then stood. For the record, I'm proud of the man I've become. I hope one day you can be proud too. He walked out to stunned silence once again. This time the silence felt like victory. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Lorenzo called Matteo. It's done. I'm free. The relief in Matteo's voice was everything. They met at their favorite cafe, ordered coffee, and planned the next chapter. Lorenzo would start a small foundation focused on LGBTQ youth support, using the modest savings he had kept separate. Matteo would keep teaching. Together they would build something that mattered. As they walked home hand in hand, Lorenzo felt the last chains of expectation fall away. The family silence had forced him to find his own voice, and that voice was finally loud enough to lead the life he had always wanted. Weeks turned into months, and the initial media frenzy settled into a steady hum of speculation. Lorenzo's foundation, called Bridge Forward, opened its doors in a modest storefront in Brooklyn. The first group of teenagers arrived nervous and guarded, much like he had once been. Watching them share stories around a simple circle of chairs reminded him why the sacrifice had been worth it. Matteo helped paint the walls bright yellow, turning the space into something warm and welcoming. Their evenings were quieter now, filled with shared meals and honest conversations about the future. One night Matteo asked the question Lorenzo had been avoiding. Do you ever regret it? Lorenzo thought about the empty seat at family dinners, the holidays he would miss, the trust fund he had voluntarily relinquished. Then he looked at the man across the table and answered truthfully. Never. The answer was tested sooner than expected. Emily showed up at the apartment unannounced one rainy afternoon, eyes red from crying. Dad had a heart scare last week. He won't admit it, but he's scared. Lorenzo's chest tightened. Despite everything, the man was still his father. He drove to the family estate that evening, the familiar gates opening automatically out of habit. Richard was in his study, looking older than Lorenzo remembered. They sat in silence for a long time before Richard spoke. You were always the strong one. I just never thought your strength would look like this. The words were not an apology, but they were close. Lorenzo left the meeting with cautious hope. Not reconciliation, but a crack in the wall. Back home, he told Matteo everything. They celebrated the small victory with takeout and laughter, the kind that came from surviving together. Yet new conflicts emerged. A former business associate offered Lorenzo a high-paying consulting role on the condition that he keep a low profile about his relationship. The implication was clear: be gay, but don't be seen. Lorenzo turned it down without hesitation. The decision cost them financially, but the integrity it preserved was priceless. Matteo's own family in California had mixed reactions. His mother sent a warm card welcoming Lorenzo, but his father remained distant, struggling with cultural expectations. Matteo flew west for a weekend to talk things through. When he returned, there were new lines of worry around his eyes. Lorenzo held him through the night, understanding that love always demanded pieces from everyone involved. At the foundation, one of the teenagers, a quiet 16-year-old named Alex, reminded Lorenzo of his younger self. Alex had been kicked out after coming out to his parents. Lorenzo spent extra hours listening, sharing his own story without the glamour. It gets better, he promised. Not easier, but better. Watching Alex start to smile again gave Lorenzo purpose that no boardroom ever had. Friendship tested them too. Lorenzo's old college friend Marcus, once inseparable, finally reached out. Their lunch meeting was awkward at first. Marcus admitted he had been scared of losing the connection they once had. By dessert, they were laughing like old times, and Marcus promised to volunteer at the foundation. The moment felt like another bridge rebuilt. Yet betrayal came from an unexpected place. A distant cousin leaked old photos of Lorenzo and Matteo to a tabloid, twisting the narrative into something salacious. The story hit the internet at midnight. Lorenzo woke to hundreds of notifications. For a moment, the old shame threatened to return. Then Matteo pulled him close and said, "They don't get to define us." Together they issued a simple statement focusing on love and acceptance. The backlash was loud but short-lived. Support poured in from strangers, from other LGBTQ leaders, even from a few family friends who had stayed silent until now. The experience taught Lorenzo that visibility, while painful, could also heal. One crisp autumn evening, they attended a small gallery show featuring Matteo's new series inspired by their journey. The paintings were raw and beautiful, full of light breaking through darkness. Standing beside Matteo as guests offered praise, Lorenzo felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money or status. This was their life, earned and honest. Later, walking home under streetlights, Matteo stopped and turned to him. "I'm proud of the man you're becoming." Lorenzo kissed him right there on the sidewalk, no longer caring who saw. The kiss tasted like freedom. The foundation grew steadily. They hired a part-time counselor and expanded weekend workshops. Lorenzo discovered he had a talent for fundraising that didn't rely on the Vanderbilt name. Donors responded to his authenticity. One particularly generous grant allowed them to open a second location in Queens. The work was exhausting but fulfilling in a way corporate life never had been. Through it all, the internal conflict lingered in quiet moments. Lorenzo still woke sometimes with the phantom weight of expectation on his chest. Matteo would sense it and pull him back with gentle words and steady presence. Their love had deepened through every trial, becoming something resilient and true. Family Thanksgiving arrived with mixed emotions. Emily invited them to a small gathering at her new apartment, away from the main estate. Richard did not attend, but he sent a bottle of expensive wine with a note that simply read, "For the table." It was progress. They sat around a modest table, laughing and sharing stories. For the first time in months, Lorenzo felt the family fracture beginning to mend, one careful piece at a time. That night, back in Brooklyn, he and Matteo danced slowly in the living room to an old record. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but bright. Lorenzo had lost an empire and gained himself. The silence that once terrified him had become the space where his real life began. Winter brought new challenges. A major donor pulled funding after receiving pressure from conservative business circles. The foundation's budget shrank overnight. Lorenzo spent sleepless nights recalculating spreadsheets while Matteo graded papers at the kitchen table. They learned to stretch every dollar, turning the setback into an opportunity to involve the community more deeply. Teenagers organized fundraisers, local artists donated pieces for silent auctions, and slowly the numbers stabilized. Through the struggle, Lorenzo discovered leadership qualities he never knew he possessed. One particularly difficult board meeting for the foundation ended with him standing firm against skeptical investors. "This isn't charity," he told them. "It's justice." The words echoed the speech he had given in the ballroom months earlier. Matteo watched from the back row, pride shining in his eyes. Their relationship faced its own test when Matteo received a job offer in Los Angeles, a prestigious teaching position at a university with triple the salary. The opportunity would mean stability, but it would also mean leaving the life they had built in New York. They talked for hours on the fire escape, weighing dreams against roots. In the end, Matteo declined the offer. "My home is wherever you are," he said simply. The decision cemented something unbreakable between them. Spring arrived with fresh hope. Richard suffered a mild heart attack that finally brought the family together in the hospital waiting room. Lorenzo sat beside his mother, holding her hand while machines beeped steadily. When Richard woke, the first thing he asked for was his son. The conversation that followed was halting and honest. No grand apologies, just two men acknowledging the distance between them. "I was wrong about a lot of things," Richard admitted quietly. Lorenzo nodded. "We both were." The moment was not a full reunion, but it was enough. Back at the foundation, Alex graduated high school and enrolled in community college with a scholarship Lorenzo had quietly funded. Watching the young man walk across the stage in cap and gown filled Lorenzo with a sense of purpose that transcended bloodlines. He realized family could be chosen as well as inherited. A misunderstanding threatened to derail everything when a reporter twisted an interview, suggesting Matteo had influenced Lorenzo's decision for personal gain. The accusation stung. Matteo withdrew for several days, questioning whether his presence was harming the man he loved. Lorenzo fought for him with the same determination that had carried him through the ballroom announcement. He held a press conference of his own, standing alone at a podium and speaking from the heart. Matteo didn't change me. He gave me the courage to be who I already was. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. Matteo returned home that night with tears in his eyes and a renewed commitment. Their love had survived another storm. Summer brought community picnics and long weekends away. They drove upstate to the same cabin where they had spent their first secret anniversary. This time there were no disguises, no hurried departures. They hiked trails, cooked over open fire, and talked about adopting a child one day. The conversations felt natural, future-oriented, full of possibility. Lorenzo's sister Emily announced her engagement, and for the first time invited both men to the wedding planning brunch. The family table was still missing Richard, but the empty chair felt less like rejection and more like unfinished business. Lorenzo contributed ideas for the ceremony, feeling the warmth of belonging return in small increments. One quiet evening Matteo surprised him with plane tickets to California. "It's time you met my parents properly." The visit was healing. Matteo's mother embraced Lorenzo like a son. His father, still reserved, shook his hand firmly and said, "Take care of my boy." The simple words carried weight. On the flight home, Lorenzo rested his head on Matteo's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for showing me how to build family." Back in New York, the foundation hosted its first large gala. Lorenzo stood on stage in a simple black suit, Matteo beside him in a matching one. They announced record donations and new partnerships. When Lorenzo thanked the man who had walked beside him through every step, the applause was thunderous. In that moment, he understood that success had nothing to do with boardrooms and everything to do with courage and connection. Fall arrived with changing leaves and deeper conversations. Lorenzo began writing a memoir, not for fame but for the teenagers who still needed to hear that choosing love was possible. Matteo read early chapters and offered gentle feedback. Their evenings filled with laughter and honest critiques strengthened their bond even more. A final betrayal came from an unexpected source. James, Lorenzo's brother, attempted a hostile takeover of the remaining family shares Lorenzo still held through a technicality. The move was cold and calculated. Lorenzo fought back legally but without hatred. When the dust settled, he relinquished the last ties to the empire willingly. The act felt like closing a book he had outgrown. That night he and Matteo sat on the roof watching the city lights. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," Lorenzo said. Matteo smiled. "Me too." The journey had been long and painful, but every scar had led them here, to a life defined by choice rather than expectation. Lorenzo no longer needed the family's approval to know his worth. He carried it within himself, reflected in the eyes of the man he loved. The silence that once silenced a ballroom had become the quiet space where their story continued to unfold, one honest day at a time. The new year brought fresh momentum. Bridge Forward expanded to 3 locations, and Lorenzo found himself traveling to speak at universities and community centers across the country. Each talk reminded him of the scared young man he had once been, hiding behind perfect grades and practiced smiles. Sharing his story publicly became both catharsis and calling. Matteo joined him on several trips, turning hotel rooms into temporary homes filled with laughter and late-night planning. Their relationship matured into something steady and profound. Small rituals anchored them. Sunday morning coffee, Wednesday night art sessions, Friday walks through the neighborhood. These ordinary moments became the foundation of their extraordinary love. A crisis tested them again when Alex, the teenager Lorenzo had mentored, faced a family emergency that threatened his college dreams. Lorenzo and Matteo stepped in without hesitation, offering temporary housing and emotional support. Watching Alex heal reinforced their decision to foster children someday. The experience deepened their commitment to building a family beyond blood. Richard's health stabilized, and tentative dinners began at the estate. The conversations were careful, never touching the deepest wounds, but presence itself spoke volumes. Eleanor started inviting Matteo to smaller gatherings, learning to ask about his teaching work with genuine interest. The slow thawing felt like spring after a long winter. Lorenzo's memoir was accepted by a publisher who believed in its message of hope. The editing process forced him to revisit painful memories with new perspective. He realized how far he had come from the man who had stood trembling at that podium. The book's title, Choosing Silence No More, captured the journey perfectly. Matteo designed the cover art, a simple bridge of light spanning darkness. The symbolism was intentional and beautiful. During a quiet weekend away in the mountains, Lorenzo proposed. Not with a grand gesture, but with a simple ring and the words he had carried in his heart for years. Marry me. Build the rest of our lives together. Matteo's yes came with tears and laughter. They planned a small ceremony in the Brooklyn Community Garden where they had volunteered together, surrounded by the teenagers they had helped and the friends who had stayed. The wedding was intimate and joyful. Emily walked Lorenzo down the aisle. Richard attended, sitting quietly in the back row. When the officiant pronounced them married, the applause was warm and genuine. In that moment, Lorenzo understood that family could expand rather than fracture. Their honeymoon was simple, a week in a coastal cabin where they talked about the future without pressure. Returning home felt like stepping into the next chapter with open arms. The foundation received national recognition for its work. Lorenzo was invited to the White House for a summit on youth mental health. Standing in the historic rooms, he thought about the boy who had once feared his own truth. The honor belonged to every young person who had found courage through their programs. Back in New York, life settled into a rhythm of purpose and partnership. They bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood, painted the walls together, and planted a garden. The ordinary acts of home building healed old wounds. One evening, while watching the sunset from their porch, Matteo turned to him and said, "We made it." Lorenzo smiled, knowing the words were true. The journey had included misunderstandings, sacrifices, and moments of doubt, but every step had led them here. A final confrontation with the past came when James attempted reconciliation on his own terms, offering Lorenzo a board seat if he would tone down the activism. Lorenzo declined politely but firmly. The refusal closed the last door on conditional love. He no longer needed validation from the empire he had left behind. Instead, he focused on the legacy he was building with Matteo, one that valued people over profit. The foundation launched a scholarship program named after both their families, honoring the complicated paths that had brought them together. Watching the first recipients receive their awards filled Lorenzo with quiet pride. Life continued with its mix of triumphs and ordinary days. They celebrated anniversaries, supported each other through career challenges, and grew closer with every shared sunrise. Lorenzo's internal conflicts had transformed into quiet confidence. He no longer questioned his worth or his choices. The man he had become was the one he was always meant to be. Matteo's art flourished, with gallery shows that featured pieces inspired by their shared story. Lorenzo attended every opening, standing proudly beside his husband. Their love had become a beacon for others navigating similar journeys. As another year turned, Lorenzo stood on the balcony of their home, looking out at the city that had witnessed every chapter. He thought about the ballroom silence that had started it all and felt nothing but gratitude. The unexpected consequence of that shocking announcement had been the life he had always dreamed of, built on honesty, courage, and the unwavering support of the man he loved. Matteo joined him, slipping an arm around his waist. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lights of New York sparkle below. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility and promise. Lorenzo knew there would be more challenges, more growth, more moments of choice. But he also knew they would face them together, stronger than ever. The story that had begun with stunned silence had evolved into a lifetime of shared voices, and that was the greatest victory of all. The years that followed brought both expansion and reflection. Bridge Forward grew into a national organization with chapters in 12 cities. Lorenzo traveled less as he trained new leaders, preferring to stay close to home where Matteo had taken a permanent position as department chair at a local university. Their house filled with laughter when they welcomed their first foster child, a bright-eyed 12-year-old girl named Sophia who reminded them both of the courage it took to trust again. Parenting together revealed new layers of love and patience. They navigated school meetings, doctor visits, and the delicate balance of giving Sophia space while offering unwavering support. Through it all, their marriage remained the steady center. Date nights became sacred, simple dinners where they talked about everything and nothing. One evening Sophia asked why two dads were different. Lorenzo answered honestly, sharing parts of his own journey in age-appropriate words. Her acceptance came easily, teaching them both that the next generation could learn from their truth without the weight of shame. Richard's health declined gradually. Family visits became more frequent and tender. The old man never fully apologized, but his presence at holidays and the quiet pride in his eyes when he watched Sophia play spoke volumes. Eleanor doted on her granddaughter, knitting blankets and sharing stories of Lorenzo's childhood. The circle that had once felt broken slowly mended into something new and stronger. A misunderstanding arose when media outlets revisited the original announcement, framing it as a family feud resolved. Lorenzo chose not to correct them publicly, realizing some stories were meant to evolve privately. Instead, he focused on writing op-eds about acceptance that reached millions. Matteo supported every word, editing drafts late into the night. Their partnership had become a creative force as well as an emotional one. Betrayal came one last time from an old business rival who attempted to discredit the foundation with false financial claims. The investigation cleared them completely, but the stress tested their resilience. They emerged stronger with new safeguards and deeper trust. The experience reminded Lorenzo that external forces would always try to define them, but only they could decide their worth. Sophia's adoption became official on a sunny spring morning. Standing in the courtroom with Matteo on one side and their daughter between them, Lorenzo felt the full weight of every choice that had led here. The judge's gavel sounded like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. That evening they celebrated with pizza and ice cream, Sophia's laughter filling the house with pure joy. Lorenzo looked at his family and knew the sacrifices had been worth every moment. Friendship circles expanded too. Marcus became a regular volunteer and godfather to Sophia. Other friends from different walks of life joined their orbit, creating a chosen family that felt richer than any bloodline. Holidays became gatherings of laughter and diverse stories, proof that love could bridge any divide. As Lorenzo approached his 40th birthday, he took stock of the man he had become. The once terrified heir was now a husband, father, and leader who spoke with quiet authority. The internal conflicts that had once kept him awake now surfaced only as gentle reminders to stay true. Matteo aged gracefully beside him, his art gaining national acclaim while he continued teaching with passion. Their love had weathered every season and emerged deeper. One crisp autumn day they returned to the Vanderbilt estate for a quiet dinner. Richard, frail but clear-eyed, raised a glass. To the choices that matter. The toast was simple but profound. Lorenzo met his father's gaze and saw respect there at last. The moment healed something he hadn't realized still needed mending. Back home, Sophia asked to hear the story of how her dads met. Lorenzo and Matteo took turns telling it, painting pictures with words until she fell asleep smiling. In the quiet that followed, they sat on the porch holding hands. Was it worth it? Matteo asked softly, echoing the question from years ago. Lorenzo answered without hesitation. Every single day, the life they had built was proof. From the shocking announcement that silenced a ballroom to the peaceful evenings filled with family laughter, every step had been necessary. The journey had taught them that true strength came not from empire but from authenticity, not from silence but from speaking truth. As stars appeared overhead, Lorenzo felt complete. The unexpected consequence of that long-ago declaration had been the greatest gift of his life. A love that grew stronger through every challenge, a family forged by choice, and a legacy measured in hearts changed rather than dollars earned. He squeezed Matteo's hand, grateful beyond words for the man who had walked beside him through it all. Their story continued, not in grand announcements but in quiet moments of connection that would carry them through whatever came next. And in that knowledge, Lorenzo found peace. Is it true that choosing love over legacy always leads to happiness? Or does happiness require something more complex? True or false?